All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Sunday afternoon for some of us, Sunday morning for others, and UK, I'm not even sure, Sister Abeda, what time you're at now.
It's 6 p.m. in the evening, alhamdulillah.
Okay. So dinner time, I guess, for some folks. But thank you from wherever everybody is joining. Welcome, inshallah. We can get started. Just a very quick intro and we'll get right into it. I'm Madiha, the research director at the Family Youth Institute. If you were on our last live session, you may recall that we shared some data about pornography among Muslim American youth, and the data were collected by young Muslims who surveyed about 350 youth sort of on their relationship with this struggle and their experiences with it. So we took the data, we analyzed it, and we put it into an infographic, among other things, so that everyone could make sense of it. The infographic really tells us why Muslim youth are watching pornography, how much they're watching it, why they watch it, and some strategies to really support youth with that issue. So please check out the infographics, our newly released resource. We have a lot more that are on the post on our Instagram account, including a toolkit with lots of strategies. So let's get right into it. In our last live, we really heard many of you really asking and commenting about, what do we do with this struggle? How can we heal? How can we cope with it? So we really wanted to focus today's session on giving you that chance to answer those kinds of questions about, now we've talked about this issue, we know it's there. How do we deal with it? What can we do? What are strategies? So that's really what we want to focus on today. So joining us today, we have Sister Abeda, all the way from the UK. I'll do a very quick bio, inshallah, and you guys, feel free to add. Sister Abeda is a relationship therapist with a specialism in psychosocial issues in married couples. She works with Muslims who struggle with sex and pornography addiction, and she has specialized in addiction counseling from the Institute of Sex Addiction Training, becoming the first Muslim counselor in the UK to have that qualification. And she is an accredited, approachable parenting facilitator, speaks extensively on these topics. We also have joining us Sheikh and Dr. Omar Hussein. He holds a PhD in counselor education and supervision from the University of Texas. He's a licensed professional counselor associate and a licensed chemical dependency counselor. He also graduated from the College of Islamic Studies and Arabic at Al-Azhar in Cairo. So thank you both for joining us today, inshallah, and we can get right into it. This is kind of set up as a Q&A, so I'll be asking both Dr. Omar Hussein and Dr. Abeda questions, and we'll go from there. So one of the key findings that we had from our analysis of the data was that some of the top reasons that young people turn to porn is to really cope with negative emotions, to cope with boredom, cope with loneliness, and cope with stress, and frustrations dealing with stress. So these are normal human experiences, right? All of us experience these issues. We go through them all the time. So how can I protect myself from turning to pornography when I feel these feelings? How do I deal with these feelings in a healthy way so that I don't turn to pornography? And I'll leave either one of you to jump right in, inshallah.
Okay, so brother, would you want me to go?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, bismillah. So my understanding is that obviously, as you said, all these emotions and feelings are quite normal in their everyday experiences. But looking at somebody who might be vulnerable and has addiction, then it's really important to recognize, are these feeling of being bored or feeling vulnerable or feeling angry or any of those emotions, are they potential triggers for that person? And when I work with addicts, I think it's really important for them to understand what their triggers are. And if we really unpick what a trigger means, trigger basically means that it's a thought and a feeling or a sensation that can generate a desire to act out. So when you have that particular feeling, then you would want to act out. And in terms of when we assess people, we normally say that there are three possibilities in terms of how people, or three ways through which they come towards porn addiction. So it could be an attachment-induced addiction, it could be a trauma-induced addiction, or it could be opportunity-induced. So for instance, if you look at boredom, if an addict knows that when they're bored or when they're lonely, if that's going to be a trigger, then the key thing is for them that they protect themselves, that they understand, they plan well ahead, that, you know, if in my schedule, you know, I have to, for young people, for instance, I have 2 hours, we're not going to do much. Make sure that there's good structure around that. So I think I personally, when I work with young people, it's about psychoeducation and making them understand what's going on with their addiction and not minimizing it, because cognitive distortion is a big problem with addiction, that you can minimize all those things and not really address them. So that's my understanding.
So it sounds like one of the things I was hearing from you is that it's really important to understand your specific trigger. So for some, you know, for some folks it might be trauma. For some folks it might not be any of the 4 reasons that I listed, right? Boredom or stress. But it's about taking it and making it unique to what is your specific trigger.
Very important.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Dr. Omar, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, so I'll just say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim wa bihi nasta'een wa ba'd. Just to take a step back from Sister Abeda spoke to those who have a more serious problem, even bordering on addiction or into addiction. But there's also many, I think, from this data that we wouldn't say that they have an addiction. It would be more sort of like a bad habit, but still really weighs down on them because it's obviously it's against our beliefs, right? So when I look at things like coping with negative emotions or boredom or loneliness, this is sort of a greater issue when it comes to, for example, healthy relationships. So peer relationships. Most of the people in this data, you know, they're not of marriageable age or are really thinking of that. So, you know, what about that whole group before? So having sort of healthy peer relationships, meaningful relationships, you know, what else is being done for healthy outlets with all this energy that's built up? You know, I recently had a client who said, yeah, when I exercise, I don't have the same sort of desires and urges as when I don't exercise and I'm just kind of working and sitting in front of the computer all the time. So it's very important, you know, for that energy to be burned. We are social beings. We need to be around others. And if we are around, you know, other young Muslims with similar values and meaningful values, then that's going to help us, you know, that we're not, because we're gaining something out of those relationships rather than just something superficial. And then we just kind of move on. So, you know, what happens is that people end up turning just because, you know, they're bored. They don't have anything else to do. They don't have anyone else to hang out with. So forming sort of these healthy quality relationships, going out with each other. Now, alhamdulillah, I pray, inshallah, that conditions are a lot better in most parts of the world. So kind of getting away from being behind the screens just constantly and having healthy interactions in person. All of these can really make a big difference. So I would say to those who are not into the serious addiction yet, these are some things they can do, inshallah, to cope with some of those issues like boredom or negative emotions or feeling lonely.
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that that reminder about the way that the survey was collected. Definitely, just for everybody that's joining, the data were collected about pornography consumption and not addiction. So we definitely, the data aren't specifically in the survey findings that we talk about are definitely about consumption. And like Sheikh Omar said, kind of those of you who are struggling before it gets to the point where it's an addiction. So that distinction is really, really important. And I think what I hear you saying is that these, you know, healthy strategies that we all should have anyways, like having healthy relationships with peers and having constructive use of your time, which we all know in COVID just was completely out of whack, right? And totally kind of really messed everybody up. But having those healthy things in our lives or sets it up for us so that if we're just sort of initially struggling, perhaps it's not going to open that door to it becoming a much more serious problem.
Can I also add that I was just kind of thinking, dealing with emotions, I suppose when somebody's feeling angry or frustrated or any emotion, unless we have an insight or self-awareness and that ability, what am I feeling? What's going on for me? We can sometimes just bypass all that and just not even acknowledge it. Boys can do that a lot. Unfortunately, that's a very common thing in men and then obviously in boys. So that emotional bypassing can build up a lot of negativity. So I think emotional awareness is so important, and then compassion, and not labeling yourself that, you know, because you're feeling sad or whatever means that you're this, that, or the other. Self-awareness and compassion, I think, is something that as a community we lack. I think we're good to maybe just point that out as well, inshallah.
Yeah, that's a great point. So actually, one of the things I've been thinking about a lot, and what we often see, you know, in research in general, whether it's with Muslims or not, with sort of any struggle, the first step is to accept that you have a problem, right? And to have that understanding with yourself that I'm struggling with this. So regardless of, you know, the amount of consumption that's happening, whether it's consumption or addiction, what first steps can sort of a person take towards accepting that they have this problem, and, you know, eventually then working towards changing that behavior?
So I would say that almost all the clients I have a level of acceptance. I mean, that's why they came.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really across the whole spectrum. So there are some who are like, look, I have abstained for months. I just want to develop healthy habits so I don't go back to it. Whereas there are others who it's almost a daily thing. So I think there is a level of acceptance to those, at least in my experience. And many of them, if not almost all of them, like, they care about Islam, they care about Allah, they care about being good Muslims. So it's challenging, but, you know, they're certainly maybe not what might be a stereotypical, you know, assumption or caricature of who may be involved. It's just very powerful. This pornography is very powerful. So I would say they do have some level of acceptance. What can be a little bit tricky, which I've found, is that to really get over the problem, there has to be like 100% acceptance. And I'll find I have clients that I'm like, yeah, you're like 99%, but not quite 100%, right? Because there's maybe some of those emotions or the you know, feelings of pleasure, and they'll say all the right things. Yeah, I want to stop. I don't want to do it anymore. You know, I always give this example. I'm like, if you went to a restaurant outside and it said 99% halal, would you eat over there? Like, not at all. I don't know what that other 1% is. So there really has to be 100% commitment. And I found sometimes even in those who, you know, were working on these issues, and you know, they say they want to stop and everything, but and they're very committed, but they're not fully committed. Mm-hmm. And if they're not fully committed, there's always that little door which is open, you know, for relapsing or not being able to get out of the behavior. So, you know, again, I would say most of them do have that level of commitment. For those who are sort of teetering on the end, it really takes that honest conversation. That's where maybe speaking to somebody, you know, like a mentor, youth director, imam, counselor, if you have access. I think that's what they can sort of really help for you to see that, to kind of get you over the hump to that full commitment.
Okay, so if someone's kind of struggling, and you're saying one of the best things that might help is having somebody in your life that you do look up to, that can kind of talk, and hoping that person's gonna kind of push you towards that final, you know, get over that hump and get that support.
Well, it can, yeah, because a lot of times people that have this struggle, they feel isolated and they don't feel like they have anyone that they can reach out to. So to be able to have someone that you can confide in can really be helpful. The other point, just very briefly, is that Sister Abeda spoke about education. You know, Islam is there to cut off the means before they get out of control. وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا. Do not come close to approaching, zina or unlawful intimate relationships, right? So some of the some people, some of the participants, it was like, like they'll watch a movie with explicit scenes or anything. That's not pornography technically, but some of these series that are popular series and things like that. So that can really be a door into the harder stuff, and I think that right there, many people are not understanding that, or saying that, oh well, it's just a popular show or whatever. So that's something also to be really, really careful about, because it may be that we fall into it, we're not really sure how we're getting there.
I totally agree with that. And in my experience as well, I think people stay engaging from, and for a lot of young men especially, and not exclusively just men, women as well, with pornography, they can start really young, some in their early teens. And this whole thing about minimization and just saying, oh, it's nothing, it's not a big deal, means that obviously their brain, that's how they get hooked, really. If you think about the chemical aspect or the addiction aspect, that's how they get kind of lured into just getting their daily dose of dopamine through just watching things through Netflix as well. Interestingly enough, a few years ago, I went to Pakistan to do some talks and workshops with universities and stuff. And at that point, I did some research just to see what's going on social media and Netflix and that sort of thing. And there is so much stuff out there, as Chef said, that it's technically not porn, but it is. And that's just enough for your brains to get into that cycle. So not minimizing and recognizing that this is a problem. And the way even if it's not addiction, I know obviously for young people that we're talking about today, it might not be, they might, because I do an assessment, obviously, they might not fulfill the assessment criteria. But as Muslims, obviously, as Sheikh said, and for us, the zina of the eyes is a problem, full stop. So then recognizing that the simplest kind of way of assessing is that it's not what you want, it becomes what we need. So you might wake up in the morning, not going to do that at all, but in a couple of hours you're back there, and you might not realize that you're not doing it for 5 years or 5 hours or whatever, and you think it's not addictive, but it's that need that you really, an urge in back of the mind that you want to go back to it. I think for a lot of young people, they realize that they have and we're not talking about social media today, but that need to keep going back to your phone, that urge, I think that's the common thing, that's the problem.
So if you have you guys had folks, for example, or for some of us who are listening, today, if you're not, let's say you're not at the level of an addict, right? So you're just kind of initially struggling at the beginning of the spectrum, and you do just think like, oh, it's just once or twice, right? It's just here or there, like the watching content that might be sort of more characterized as pornography. What would you recommend to someone like that? So if I told you this is my struggle, but it's not a big deal. I'm not watching that much, and what I'm watching, it's not so bad. It's, I could be worse, right? I could be doing all these other things that I know other people are doing, but it's just once or twice a week. It's not that much. And it's not affecting me. What would you say to someone, I guess, that's kind of in that situation?
Jeff, what would you say? Then I will tell you what I normally say to my clients.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
For me, I think it's really important because I work with Muslims and then I work with non-Muslims as well, kind of really looking at the core values and the belief system. So for obviously Muslims, we understand, as we established already, that there is this whole thing is a distorted way of looking at it. We all know what's permissible and what's not permissible. So for instance, when I work with older men who marry, they would say, well, I'm not committing zina, so I'm still faithful to my wife. So in their minds, obviously, and you have to undistort that thinking, kind of really. And an acronym that we find quite useful, which I often give people, is the RUN acronym that we draw from the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. When he was in that situation, when the Amir's wife grabbed him from the back, and Sheikh can tell the story way better than I can, but that he ran, And R means that you remove yourself from that situation. No matter what, you recognize that you're going to enter something that's going to lead to something else. U means that you undistort your thinking, and you don't minimize it. You see it what it is actually. And then N means that you never forget what you're going to lose, because a lot of these people, young people, they, as soon as they watch something that they're not very happy about, because the reality is that within us we know what's right and what's wrong, and when we're doing it, obviously we minimize it, but straight after, there's that guilt, there's that shame, there's that feeling of being inadequate, less than, the feeling of being a hypocrite, all those feelings. So I give run as a coping strategy, and people do find that useful.
Yeah, from the statement there, I'm not sure that they really want to stop, right? Because the way that's worded, that goes back to sort of recognizing the problem. So when I have clients like that, I would spend time sort of, speaking to them about what their habits are, what they're doing. And I think they can get a realization like, well, yeah, well, I guess maybe it isn't that different, than watching something else. But that statement alone, the example you gave, that shows me someone who is not really seriously committed, or perhaps doesn't understand what exactly they're doing. Like, well, it's not zina. I mean, that doesn't matter, right? There's still different levels and degrees, and we know the Prophet ﷺ said that the private parts just confirm or deny. Everything else, the looking, the listening, that those are all the doors, right? But Allah said, وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ. Don't follow the footsteps of shaitan. Nobody just jumps into a room and just commits zina, right? There's steps that came before, communication, and those kinds of things. So I don't think that this person is serious in wanting to stop or understanding the consequences. So I would spend a lot of time helping them sort of explore why they think like that, and what is that truly in line with their values and beliefs. And I think many of them would after that sort of probing would say, well, yeah, well, maybe it's not. So that's what my strategy would be on there.
So is it possible that sometimes when people have that kind of thinking, it's more because they internally, deeply, they recognize that this is inappropriate behavior, it is immoral behavior, and it needs to be stopped, but they feel ashamed with the stigma that might come if they accept that it's a problem. And so instead it's easier to say, well, it's not so bad, I could be doing this when I'm not, I'm kind of over here. And it's because in their mind it's a way to separate themselves from what's seen as like really, really bad. And this is where, well, it's a struggle, but I'm still doing all this other stuff. So is it possible that sometimes it's just rethinking our beliefs and rethinking how we think about the struggle, and that helps us get to that level of acceptance and then commitment?
Yes, no doubt. I mean, and that goes back to sort of, analyzing the thoughts, right? Reframing what exactly a problem is. It's easy to justify things, well, at least I'm not doing this, right? I'm not committing this terrible thing. But that's not really the attitude of a believer, right? That, well, I'm doing something less, or at least I'm not doing that. I mean, we're striving to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to try to do the best we can. And even if we fall short, as we do in many, many things, we say, okay, we fell a little bit short, but not to kind of brush it off and be like, well, at least I didn't kill anybody, right? Like that's not really a healthy attitude or relationship to have.
I mean, you're absolutely right that for a lot of people, that's why they stay, they get to the place where they actually get hooked, because they keep minimizing it. And that is as we know, that's a cognitive distortion when you minimize something. But I suppose when you probe, address it, probe it. I obviously do a lot of history taking. I'm trained in a modality where background history is very important, even for young people. And if you look at their stories, and for some of these, you know, they might be bullied at school, they might have had self-esteem issues or whatever. And the problem is that when they are not so feeling so good about themselves, you know, and if they're socially isolated, if they're not into physical activities, then they obviously know that because they do it in secrecy, whatever they're doing. So then obviously the whole thing about shame and guilt and feeling worth, it's just a very shackling position. And the more you recognize that you're doing something you're not meant to do, the more you feel get into that negative cycle. So I feel that unless, and that's the first step anyway, unless they actually recognize that it's something they don't really want, but it's something they need, no matter what they're saying, obviously, that becomes the starting point for them.
Okay, so I think what I'm hearing a lot is that for this struggle, a lot of it starts with reflection, internal reflection, recognizing your triggers, recognizing your feelings, you know, getting to that point of true commitment, right? Reflecting on your thinking patterns and your behaviors and how they align. So it sounds like a big first step for most of us that are struggling with this would be around those lines. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. So I heard, you know, both of you kind of, and you know, some of this preliminary data that we have shows that young women are also struggling with pornography and consuming it, which, you know, it's to some extent a misconception that I think a lot of folks have. In your experiences, how has the female sort of experience with pornography kind of been different or the same to men that you sort of have dealt with? If you could kind of share that for folks.
So can I go first on this yet?
Of course, yes.
So I think statistically we say that 30% of the wider population where they have an actual addiction issue, they say they're females. And obviously this data doesn't represent the Muslim community separately, or I'm not sure in terms of the age or where are these people. But obviously I've been doing this for long enough to see that in my practice I do work with women who have porn addiction, women who have sex addiction as well. Now, in terms of the difference, I don't think there's any difference as such in terms of what's going on for them emotionally. There are two things that are obviously quite often that for women there is, or for girls, there is that added level of stigma and shame, because we obviously somehow as a community, which is absolutely wrong, that we allow men to be more promiscuous, or, you know, lads being lads or whatever. Whereas with women, we expect them to behave very differently. Although Islamically, obviously, everybody should behave in the same way as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala advises. So I think the problem becomes with women is that when they feel ashamed, then they don't really reach out for help. That's the most important issue here. In terms of looking at and I know we're not focusing on addicts as such, but when we're looking at, for instance, sex addiction, which is something that I look into a lot as well, is that for we would say that for women, it's more to do with their attachment wounds and their traumas from that aspect, because women are, again, not generalizing, but women are more emotional in the sense that they seek attachment in a different way. So that's what the research says.
Can you, before Dr. Amayur jump in, can you just explain for everybody what does attachment bonds sort of mean? So I know we all know it very well, but just, you know, just for the folks who are listening who don't have mental health backgrounds, and so can you just elaborate about that?
Sure. So attachment is a concept that we look at how the child connects with the primary caregiver in the first few years of their relationship. So if it's a secure attachment, we hope that that child, when they grow up into becoming an adult, they would be more confident, more proactive, more resilient in their adult relationships, as opposed to not being securely attached, insecurely attached, or preoccupied or anxious. And there is a lot of evidence, and because I do a lot of relationship work as well, that when you do detailed history taking, people who have attachment wounds where they notice that the primary caregiver, for whatever reason, you know, mothers go through postnatal depression or domestic violence or whatever, if they are in that environment in the early years where the healthy focus wasn't on that child, then that would potentially turn into attachment wound, which later on in their adult life can become a barrier and a problem in forming healthy, stable relationships. People can work through that, obviously, but it can become an issue for many people.
So for women, it's potentially more about, and of course not across the board, but generally it's more about and struggles with relationships, history with relationships, and just same page, right? I mean, relationships the way people talk about like dating, right? We're talking about healthy relationships, whether it's with, you know, family members, you know, a healthy relationship with your father, your, you know, all those relationships. And then as you get older, of course, in the right context, a healthy romantic relationship, you know, with your spouse. But it's relationship based for women. Omar, did you want to add to sort of the experience of women, and how has it been similar or different to what you're seeing?
I'll just say two things very briefly. You know, my experience has not been directly with female clients, and I think there's reason for that. We're just naturally, particularly with a subject like this, you know, you're more comfortable going to someone of the same gender to discuss. But you know, the pornography industry has systemically targeted women in terms of the content they put out. Men and women process things differently. So they have certainly, that's been an effort to get women. And the second point I'll just say is that I hope that by just asking this question, Jazakallah khairan, we see that there really is, it really affects everyone. Everyone is affected by this issue. I've had older men who are retired, married men, families, you know, very, very young. Like there's everything in between. So it's not just limited to, oh, this is, you know, the 16-year-old boy and they have the issue. It really stems across so many different segments. And if we can just if that's the only thing we take away from this, then inshallah that will help those who, you know, when we see the reality of what's happening, to be able to get the help that they need, inshallah.
Can I add a point here, if I may? That I think the other thing that as a community we need to understand, that in terms of the spectrum as to what horrible and devastating, disgusting content is out there, and recognize that for young people, this is not just that you're watching something that's not permissible. Actually, the deep-rooted psychological issues that these children, if they carry on that path, I mean, it's just, and I'm sure Sheikh will agree that some of the adults that we work with, if they go through this whole thing and not seek help, I mean, it's just a devastating impact on their relationship. And going back to the content, I'm working with a 19-year-old who progressively, and that's the nature of this thing, that obviously you want more and more extreme content. So things like BDSM, for instance, it's devastating for, and I don't want to obviously go too much into what that is, but this whole thing about taking away a young person's dignity, their honor, their self-esteem, their confidence, and it means that in terms of how they're going to behave later on in their workplace or relationships, it's actually very worrying. And I'm sure you know that, hence we're here. But I just want to say that it's not, we cannot minimize and not just think that it's not a big deal, because it's definitely is a very serious thing.
So I think what I'm hearing from you is that for people to recognize, you know, and specifically women, that it's not just affecting, you know, if you are, for example, married, it's not just affecting your sexual relationship with your spouse, right? It's not just tied to like that aspect of your life. And it's also you're taking on the values that are shown in the content about women, how women are represented, how they're portrayed, what's appropriate, healthy behavior between genders. And that's for both men and women, right? You're also slowly seeing these behaviors and what they mean for how men and women should treat each other, and then you're internalizing them. So struggling with this issue is not just about, it doesn't just impact, you know, the sexual aspect of your relationships, it impacts everything else as well. And so healing means healing from all those different things that might have become internalized in you, but you didn't even sort of realize it or pay attention to it.
Definitely. And one of the things that we see later on is in terms of how people, men who are addicted don't know how to respect women, or they don't know how to emotionally connect to women. Because in my psychosexual work, I see that a lot. And for young people, many of them, because as a community, we don't do sex education very well.
Mm-hmm.
So for a lot of young people, this is their main source of sex education, unfortunately. They bypass the whole relationship stuff. So they don't know how to emotionally connect with their spouses. And it becomes a big problem later on. So definitely.
Yeah. Yeah. What would you say for someone, you know, who, and I think, you know, Dr. Omar, you kind of said this before about, we always are going to, naturally as human beings, we're going to struggle in our path to strive, right? For goodness and for following, you know, the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what we know we're supposed to do. We're going to struggle. That's human nature. So for someone that's kind of struggling with this issue specifically, and they kind of go, you know, and it happens to most struggling with anything bad, right? Is that you might have a period where you're good, you haven't watched anything, you've been, you know, refraining, and then you kind of go back. You know, I know that in the addiction world that's called relapse, but I want to make sure we're covering the whole spectrum, right? And not just addiction. So what are your thoughts and your feedback to someone that is dealing with that? Is, you know, I'm doing good for 2 weeks, I haven't watched anything even, you know, and I've been really good about refraining from even just looking at things on TV that aren't specifically, you know, super heavy considered pornography, but that opened that door, and I've been doing it, and I have a strategy in place, you know, maybe I kept myself busy, whatever it is for that person. And then, you know, that day comes and you slip a little bit, and then you're dealing with the shame and the guilt. And for some of us that turns into, you know, I'm failing at this anyways, might as well just open the whole door. For some of us, I mean, like, okay, let me try again. And so you just keep going back and forth between, you know, sort of withdrawal and relapse and watching and not watching. What are your tips on people kind of dealing with those emotions and that back and forth? What would you say to folks?
Yeah, so in the situation that you're describing, if this is a repeated pattern over a period of years, then I think it's time to sort of reach out for help and go beyond, because what this individual has been trying has not been working consistently. Because if you have a plan in place which is working consistently, what's going to happen is that, look, we're always going to have desire in us.
Mm-hmm.
I don't care if you are newly married, married for 10 years, not married, but we have boundaries that Islam gave us that we don't just go and just satisfy ourselves just at the blink of an eye because we feel like it, right? But what happens is that if your strategies are consistently in place and they're effective, then it's not going to throw you off as much as if it was before. So we're not going to, it's almost impossible anywhere. You're going to be exposed to images. You're going to see things, you're going to hear things, you're going to come across things. But someone who is deep in the struggle, they'll get fixated on that. It may lead to something else. Someone who's successfully been able to implement a plan that's working, it will not faze them as much, and they'll be able to sort of move on. So if it's been happening, and I've had many clients like this. Oh, you know, I was good for 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
And then I started using. I was good, you know, when I was in my first year of medical school. And then, okay, so we said, let's look at what was working and why. So for example, while I was super busy, I was studying all the time. I was too tired to do anything else. Okay, so it never really it wasn't really dealt with. It was just periods of time that were stopping you. So if it's been happening for a period of time, then I think that's where a move towards professional help is needed. You can not be classified an addiction, but still have a really, really bad habit that you need help with. Just because it's a bad habit doesn't mean we don't need assistance with it. So in this particular case, it really sounds a lot like, this is not something, or it's going to be very difficult to overcome it by yourself. So this is where reaching out and using resources such as counseling, the toolkit that FYI provides, or other organizations, that's the step I think that needs to be taken, rather than just letting it. The earlier we get it, the better it is. In an ideal world, we're starting with young kids and teaching them age appropriate gender interaction and Islamic sexual ethics and morality. So that's the long game for us to really tackle this. But for those who've kind of fallen into it, the earlier you are, the easier it is to get over. But if you're seeing repeated patterns for years and years, then I would say that it's going to be very difficult for you to stop it yourself. It's time to seek some professional help.
Can I also add that becoming, as we said earlier, the becoming self-aware and kind of understanding what's happening. So you act out, then there's obviously regret and shame. Then you kind of think about reconstructing your life. You make those intentions, and then what happens is that the addiction, the habit, or we're not calling it addiction, the compulsivity or whatever, is dormant for a while. So you haven't done it for 6 months or whatever, but then something triggers you, and that trigger could be that you've lost a friend, lost a job, or a difficult exam is coming up or whatever. And then you start preparing, then you start looking. I'm not going to look much. I'm just going to do this, just browse, whatever. And then there's obviously another relapse or slip. So what we call a small lapse in progress, that you're making progress, but then you've gone back. But it's important to recognize because everybody will have a different cycle, really. So self-awareness is so important, and not denying that there is a problem. I suppose that's very important.
I think you made a great point about how even though it's a small lapse, it's still a small lapse in your your trajectory of progress. You're still making progress. And maybe that's what people need to think about, regardless of where you are on the spectrum, right? If you're an addict and you are seeking therapy, if you're somebody that's got a habit, got a problem, hasn't gotten to therapy yet, but recognizing that if you are trying to heal, you've tried to, you've created this plan for yourself to, you don't watch for a while, and then you have a little, slip up, recognizing that you're still going upward, right? You're still going towards your trajectory. You're still of progress, success, of trying, and recognizing at least that it's a problem and you're working on it. And if you have a little dip, you might have a little dip here, but it's still a dip going upward, right? And so, having some I think what I'm hearing from you both is, one, process whatever emotion you're feeling with the fact that you failed, right? And reframe that in your mind that, one, we're all humans. I'm gonna slip up. I'm gonna make a mistake. So let me first process that feeling. Then let me reflect and think about what was my trigger, right? Why did I slip up? What happened around that time? That made me kind of slip a little bit, right? And then take the next step to keep going on my trajectory upwards of healing and progress. So it sounds like that self-compassion, and we know, even, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he always just wants us to come back, right? And come back and seek that forgiveness. And so being hard on yourself is important in the moment, so you recognize that you slipped, but then working through that with some compassion and rahmah and going back to Allah, and then getting back on your journey. If you're not, obviously at the extreme end of addiction, sounds like that's really where folks need to do some work.
Definitely. I think a lot of people go back to it more and more when there's lack of self-compassion and there's more shame and guilt, because that's when shaitan gets us the most, isn't it? And I think in terms of knowing that there has to be a way of not blocking these things. I think for me, that's what I say to young people, that you can't really not be strict on hard on yourself in terms of your boundaries. So simple things like lowering your gaze. You'll have to get into that practice. You have to lower your gaze.
Yep.
No exception. If gym is your trigger, then you'll have to run on the road. You can't go to the gym. So knowing ourselves, I think self-awareness and knowing what pushes you to those behaviors really is, and we all have our own struggles, isn't it? Everybody has different type of struggles.
Mm-hmm.
But recognizing and then be a bit, not hard on yourself, but that self-discipline, that's not my thing. Somebody else might not have a problem with that. And each of one of us is different in that sense. So I think that's important as well.
Right. And so I want to shift gears to what both of you sort of mentioned. I think what we've been talking about is your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And religiosity and porn, right? I could ask, why doesn't religiosity protect a person from pornography, right? But I know that's a very loaded question. So I'm just going to open it up sort of generally is, you know, we know, I think you all know in your experience working with folks, we've also gotten confirmation about it from sort of this data preliminarily is that people who are, you know, our youth who are struggling with this, they're not doing it because they think it's right? They're not doing it because they're, you know, that they're not religious or they don't pray or they don't fear Allah. Like, but the reality is those feelings all exist in this person. There are people who pray and who know this is wrong and who have, you know, these religious beliefs about this behavior, and yet they struggle with this. So inside you can imagine they've got lots of conflicting feelings of, you know, how can I pray? You know, I'm praying, but then I'm engaging in this behavior. Or I love and fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but I'm engaging in this behavior. It's like very conflicting, right, inside. And so what would you suggest to folks in terms of how they kind of navigate these feelings that are internally going on inside of them, these conflicting feelings and behaviors, and then sort of how can they work on repairing their relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through this struggle?
Yeah, well, you know, Allah gave us Islam as a guidebook, but the question of, you know, why doesn't religiosity protect someone from porn? There's many other things that we fall into because, you know, خُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ ضَعِيفًا, the human being was created in a state of weakness. So we are going to slip up. We are going to mess up. We're not going to get it right. But Allah it's basically a lifetime of making progress, not perfection, right? We look to the Prophet ﷺ, who is that model of perfection, but we're not going to reach his level, right? So with any issues that we have, some people have bad temper, some people think nothing of backbiting someone, and you say, well, they pray, in fact, you know. So, you know, it's we have different struggles, and this is a struggle that some people have. One of the challenges is that it's appealing to something which is natural in us. Unlike, say, you know, like alcohol is mainly people, it's because of a social environment, or it's a coping mechanism. But there's not a natural inclination if you're just sitting around, hey, I just want to have a drink, right? Generally speaking. But with this, if we were all on an island somewhere, for humanity to continue, we would kind of figure out what needs to be done. So it is something innate in there, and the feelings that guilt and shame cycle. The first thing I would say is that's actually a blessing in a way, because it shows you still care, instead of just saying, well, forget it, I'm just going to do whatever I want. Sometimes I've had clients who are just broken in front of me, and I congratulate them for coming and seeing me, and kind of takes them aback. But it's like, well, if you didn't care, you wouldn't be here. But you have this desire to do something about it. Secondly, that there's too many hadith and traditions to mention, but if we have, in the moment of sincere repentance, like, and really at the end of the day, only we know if we're being sincere in repentance. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forgive you. And if 6 months go by and you relapse again, and you go through the same sincere repentance, Allah will forgive you again. Now, we're not justifying or saying do that or anything by any means, but it's really important for us to understand that when that repentance is sincere, Allah is forgiving us. And so that will help get us through some of the darker times, because it's not like everything was for naught before. You know, you mentioned the point about how you can go a period of time and then relapse and it feels like you didn't accomplish anything. That's absolutely incorrect. Research shows us any period of abstaining is positive change, helping that brain sort of rewire. You built a lot of great habits in those 8 months, 9 months, whatever it is. So we can't just throw it all away. So if we're sincere, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives us every single time. And if we were to die in that state, then inshallah it would be in a state of accepted repentance. We can't just minimize that, you know. And so ultimately, inshallah, as those who are struggling will overcome this, it will actually strengthen your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because there's really no one else you can turn to. I mean, could most of us, we can't go tell our parents that we had this struggle. We can't tell close family members. The only one we can turn to is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is different than, you know, when you're trying to get a job or you're trying to get married. You know, it's like everybody's making dua for you, but here you just feel you can't tell anybody. But you talk to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these are all very positive signs of Iman and signs that you care. And, you know, once that realization is there that, you know, I'm struggling with this, how do I overcome it? Then as long as, you know, we're taking those steps, inshallah, that's the effort that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees. And I think that's important as a reminder, because it's easy to really get lost. And, you know, now I'm going to stop praying and, you know, stop making the du'as. What's the point, right? And you get in the cycle, and then, okay, no, that was wrong. I need to go back to the prayer. So that should definitely be a part. That's why the spiritual component is a part of all of this, along with cognitive behavioral therapy and, you know, everything else that's being done. And that's what Muslims are looking for when they're looking for resources.
I really liked what you said of life is, it's a lifetime. I'm going to probably say it wrong now that I'm thinking about it, but you said it's about progress and not perfection, right? We're living progress and not perfection. And so for anyone that's struggling, know that that back and forth that you go through, as long as in that back and forth, you know, where the slip ups you have, you turn towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with that sincere repentance, that's what he's looking for. And so like it's really inspiring to hear you say that at the end of this, you might actually, this might be what gives you a strong relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then that's the unique journey that he gave you. So I would like really encourage anyone that's listening to keep that in mind, is that it is your struggle, it is your journey, but it's that journey that brings you close to him, because you actually do care and still have those feelings of shame and guilt, which are actually really important because it means you still care. So that I really, really appreciated hearing that.
Yeah, and, you know, just briefly, I'll add that, you know, Allah doesn't hold grudges. He doesn't. This, you know, if I'm working with a couple, understandably, a spouse may really feel, you know, it's going to take time to get over if their partner has been involved in this. Like, it's understandable, it's a human thing. That's not for Allah. You could have been doing this your whole life, and, you know, you get on a path where you get rid. There's nothing that Allah's not. Hey, I got you again, right? That's not how it works. So I would really encourage everyone, just in general, not just with this issue, to really, you know, ponder those 99 names. I know sometimes we just kind of have it on the wall and it looks nice, but those names are like life-changing when you really contemplate and look at them. And Allah tells us, you know, فَدْعُوهُ بِهَا, Allah has the best of names, so call him by. That can really be something, again, not just for this issue, but for all of us.
Sister Abda, did you want to add anything?
I was just saying that as practitioners, obviously we know that this is not a moral issue. This is not for people who are struggling. This is not the spiritual strength is actually such a beautiful thing, because we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves the person who is struggling, yet he's trying. And that's becomes a strength, really, because we don't judge, obviously, people. This is a cognitive issue. People are struggling. This is a mental health issue for them, really. But some of the most broken people that I see in the therapy room also have really good hearts. So they're remorse, they're crying, they're broken every single day. They recognize that this is something that they don't want to do. So as Sheikh said, obviously, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not in the business of punishing people. And I often say to people that remind them of the woman who was granted the forgiveness for giving, a prostitute who was granted forgiveness for giving water to a dog, really. And that one act was so precious and beautiful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So in terms of judgment, I think once people have compassion from themselves and not judge themselves, I think that's when they start asking for help or looking for help. Because if you keep being mean and horrible to yourself, you're not going to help yourself either. You just push yourself down. And sometimes we can be our worst enemies when
Sister Abeda, I think you cut off. I'm not sure.
Oh, sorry. Can you still hear me? So I'm sorry. I was just wanted to add that. Sorry.
Yep. No, I appreciate it. I'm keeping an eye on this one, being close to the end here. And so if you had to give your, sort of top 2 tips, just very quickly, of what you would say to folks who are struggling with this issue, no matter where they are and looking for healing, what would you say?
I can go first. So the first thing I would say is you can overcome this, and many, many people have. I know it may seem like it's impossible in the moment. It seems like you're never going to get through it. You have the shame cycle. You do it, you feel guilty. But many people have overcome this. I've had clients who have been on the verge of suicide because this has gotten so bad. And they were able to get through it with spiritual practices, with groups and different things. So you can overcome it, and many people have. Secondly, we have resources now that didn't exist even 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not just about, it's an issue. We've established it's an issue. We knew it was an issue. We have research now that shows it's an issue. We have resources now like we have not had before. And we have, alhamdulillah, we have the FYI toolkit. I don't think there's any other toolkit out there like that. We have organizations such as Purify Your Gaze, which I'm a part of, which is completely anonymous to join. You have qualified therapists who are Muslim, who have Islamic values as well, right? And will work with your values to help you overcome this. So there are resources now that maybe, like I said, didn't even exist 5 or 10 years ago. So people do overcome this, and there are resources now to make that a reality more than there were before. Those are the 2 things I would say.
Jazakallah khair. And I would just add that anybody who's struggling, I think it's important to challenge the core beliefs that they can't do it, and then just seek help. Like the Sheikh said, that there's so much out there, and there's no judgment, and you are not alone, because there's so many people who are going through the same thing. So I think those are the 2 things that I would add.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate that. And I think there's a few things for if you're struggling with this, like both of you mentioned, there are lots of resources out there. There's, the FYI toolkit. There is lots of different organizations that are actually even working on healthy sex education in our communities. So there is a lot more out there. Now it's up to us to utilize it. If you aren't struggling with this is not your personal issue. You also can support someone that's struggling in your circle, right? Whether it's your spouse, whether it's your child and you're a parent, whether it's a friend or a loved one. So for those of you that are listening that are in that boat, I would say share these resources so that we can reduce the stigma and the shame that people feel about reaching out and getting help. So, you know, the infographic, sharing that, the toolkit within your circles, the different organizations that are out there. Get it out there so we can stop, you know, stop the stigma that's tied to this and let people feel comfortable knowing, hey, you know what, there are other people struggling with this and it's okay for me to get help. And there is help, you know, there for me. So inshallah, wherever you are, there's something that you can do with this struggle so that we can all, you know, sort of heal and progress as a community, inshallah. We're at time, inshallah, so jazakallah khair. I really, really appreciate Sheikh Dr. Omar for joining us and Sister Abeda for joining us all the way from the UK. Jazakallah khair to all the listeners and everybody who joined the live. Inshallah, I pray that it was beneficial. May Allah bless everyone's time and put barakah in our conversation today, and let it be a source of healing for anyone that is struggling with this issue, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum.
Thanks.